Hi friends, it's Unicorn. In the past 3 years, on each one of the International Women's Day, I recommend 9 books about women's rights, feminism, social justice, and inspiring women's memoir to my friends on a social media platform that we all use. So today, in celebrate the International Women's Day, which is actually yesterday, I think it's a great chance for us to look back to those recommendations, and I wanted to talk about why I recommended them and why I still recommend them. Initially, I wanted to put all the 3 years worth of books in one video, but I quickly realized that will be a 3-year long video. So to avoid that, I'm gonna do a mini series, maybe 3 or 4 episodes, talking about the books that I recommend each year. So today, let's start with the year of 2018. So in 2018, I recommended these books to my friends. The first book I recommended in 2018 is A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. This is one of the first books that I read when I started to seek out for feminist writing, and this is a piece of nonfiction work based on a series of speeches and lectures that Woolf delivered. I believe this is a book that everybody tells everybody else to read, and the idea is simple. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Independence and solitude are the two most valuable things for female writers, which is true to a lot of us today, because in the longest history, women have been surrounded by the countless family household chores and the interruption from children and other family members. She examined the situation by inventing a sister of Shakespeare. If the sister has the same passion and talent for literature as Shakespeare, what would happen to her as a girl or a young woman living in the 16th century? The sister would probably get pressured by the society and the family to give up her dream and passion and put her whole heart into housework and marriage. I'm very, very sorry to say, this is until today a very common phenomenon. As I was going through the book recommendation list, I got distracted by this piece of news saying that the president of Suzhou University, one of the top 211 universities in China, said we should differentiate the education we got for boys and girls, make boys more like boys and make girls more like girls. This is an entire statement based on gender bias, and I cannot believe that it came from a president of a higher education institution. Countless things like this, which make this book first published in 1929, almost 100 years ago, still relevant today in the third decade of the 21st century. But speaking of the book was published almost 100 years ago, I believe some of the things that Virginia Woolf addressed was a little bit outdated because things have changed from then to now, or did they? The second book I recommended that year was I Know Why the Caged Bird Sing by Maya Angelou. This is a classic that I believe everybody have heard of, if not read. This is Maya Angelou's autobiography talking about her experiences growing up in Arkansas and California when the racial segregation was still in use. Maya Angelou wrote about the racism that they have to face and combat every day, and the feeling of loss and abandonment that surrounded her, and the rape and sexual assault that impacted her life. As non-Americans, we all learned that racial segregation is part of American history, but it's very hard for us to get the sense, or at least for me, to get the sense that how recent that part of history was. I still remember the astonishment that I got. Sorry about my cat. I still remember the astonishment I got when I first realized that racial segregation was ended on paper less than 60 years ago, and I was so shocked that the first black kid went to a white public school at the year of 1960. So I recommended this book to my friends because how much we can learn from the raw and honest writing and representation about black people's life back then, and it shows how much harder it is for you if you are a woman. Following, I recommended Why I March, images from Women's March all around the world. This is a photo collection of the Women's March happened on the January 21, 2017. January 21, 2017 is the day after the inauguration of the former President of the United States, Donald Trump. On that day, millions of people from 673 cities from all around the world stood up for this worldwide protest. and it is also the largest single-day protest in the US history. It was not only a march for women's rights, but people also called for equality, of racial justice, of LGBTQ community, of immigrants, of healthcare and environment, and freedoms of religion, and etc. I still remember the fact worries the public that half of the voters didn't show up in the 2016 presidential election in the US. So my favorite picture in this book was a kid holding a sign, "I care about women's rights, so in 2028 I vote." I recommended this book because I want us to all remember that march, and more importantly, remember why we came to that point of history. To this day, we still see a lot of divisions in all sorts of public issues. So vote if you can, no matter which opinion you're holding, because just remember, billions of people in the world still cannot vote and cannot decide their fate. But don't lose hope, because we have the children like that who will be voting in 2028 and in the future. And then I recommended The Handmaid's Style by Margaret Atwood. This is a modern classic. It's a dystopian novel set in a world where women are not allowed to read and write and even think, and their only value is reproducing because of the declining birth rate. The story is terrifying. We follow our protagonist Alfred, which is not even her real name. She is a handmaid living in this commander's family to reproduce, and she's struggling because she's not allowed to read, write, and think, but she still remembers the days that before the world became this. This book shows us this extreme patriarchal society to remind us somehow women's rights can be abolished overnight, and no trust can be found in this world, and people are divided into different power groups, and each power group had their strict rules to obliterate humanity. I recommended this book because first of all, it's a beautifully written book. The language is atmospheric, the plot is catchy, and the story is terrifying. But also, with the declining of birth rate in a lot of countries, especially in East Asian countries, women's rights has been more and more neglected and challenged. Having babies has once again, if not always, become the sole purpose of a womanhood, according to media and some propaganda. So I recommended this book to remind us that if we're not careful, how bad things will go and how powerless that would be. Next, I recommended a prose poetry collection, Why God is a Woman by Nin Andrews. This is a story set on a magical island where they are centralized by women and men became the second sex. It's talking from a boy's perspective, talking about the sexism that he faced growing up and the body shaming he got and how people are judge him purely based on appearances. It mirrored a lot of issues in our society, but with a gender switch. This book will challenge you, and a lot of the things that you see happen to the boy will make you uncomfortable. It will make you question why you're getting uncomfortable when you see the social norms in our society to women applies to a boy. And this uncomfortableness leads us to see a lot of issues that we couldn't even see in our day-to-day life. Plus, it's a very beautiful story, and the poems are just so good. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Following, I recommended the Odyssey, and this specific translation was done by Emily Wilson. Emily Wilson is the first woman in the English history to translate and publish the Odyssey. Can you believe it? The translation of this ancient text dated back to the 17th century, and after nearly 400 years, we finally got one female translator. In the translator's note, Emily Wilson expressed her idea of translation, saying that translation always necessarily involves interpretation, and she was avoid to importing the contemporary sense of sexism into the ancient poems, but she also didn't shy away from the existed sexism and patriarchy that are already in this book. For example, she didn't use the word maid to describe the enslaved women in the story because maid may imply that they're free when they're clearly not. When I read this book, it was such a soothing experience. I really loved the language, and I appreciate the effort that Emily Wilson put in to make the story accessible while keep the meanings as original as possible. So that's why I recommend it to my friends. Next, I recommended We Should All Be Feminist by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This is a short text from her TED Talk that she gave on the same topic. My biggest takeout from this book is it made me realize how much we have degraded our femininity in our day-to-day life without knowing it. I remember there's a phase in my college life where we like to call the other female classmates brother XYZ or a manly girl when they are showing tough, fearless, strong, passionate personalities. With time going on, I don't use those terms on myself or my classmates anymore, but I didn't really think about it a lot until I read this book that year. I realized it's ridiculous to bound certain personalities to a gender-biased impression. Femininity is a diverse concept. To bind some personalities to certain gender is to deny those people who have those personalities in other genders. And it is to see people through a stereotypical lens and also degrade people with those personalities in some level. So from the time I read this book, like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, I choose to not be apologetic to my femininity anymore and to be respected in all my femaleness. And I want to address an issue about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is that she apparently said something really harmful to the trans community. I just knew this from a video that I watched from Alice's channel, The Book Castle. I will link the video down below. It has nothing to do with the author. She was just talking in the end about the fact. So I'm still digesting this piece of information and try to set my mind on it. So by that time in 2018, I recommended this book. Actually, in my next video, I recommended another book from her again, but we'll talk about it later. Following, I recommended Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks. This is a book that I read with the Feminist Orchestra Book Club on Goodreads, hosted by Jin from Jin Bookish Thoughts and Lauren from Lauren Wade. This is the first feminist theory book that I have read, and I got so much from it. Reading with a group of people also helps too. And this book will forever have a special place in my heart because through discussing this book, I met my good friend Nicole from Nicole is Here to Learn, a brilliant woman, illustrator, and booktuber. I'll link her channel down below. If you haven't done so, check her out. You will love her videos. This book discussed various of topics around feminism, but the three things that I remember the most is, firstly, it talks about how feminism cannot be separate from the race and class equality because different classes and races of people, they have different needs and goals to accomplish in feminism. Neglecting those differences will cause issues. And also, it makes me think patriarchy differently, how adapting domination and patriarchal system sometimes can make life easier for female too. The book gives a great example of child abuse because a lot of people didn't realize child abuse is a kind of adapting of patriarchal thinking because it implies that the powerful have the right to rule over the powerless. When I read about this, I was like, boom, mind-blowing. I never put two and two together, but everything makes sense after that. Bell Hooks also talks a little about international feminism and the Western imperialism and colonization. She suggested that when dealing with issues in other countries, Western feminism should avoid to colonize or inscribe the Western imperialist thinking and address the issues in a manner that suits the local people, which I highly agree. So I recommend this book to my friends just because how much I learned from it. The last book I recommended that year was Hunger by Raksangay. This is a heavy-hearted memoir talking about Raksangay's life from childhood to now. Raksangay wrote about the trauma that happened in her youth, which is the rape happened and the rape culture followed that. And the coping mechanism that she used is to eat a lot and make herself big. So naturally, she is facing a lot of body shaming, and also she wrote about the difficulties that she's facing living as an overweight woman in her day-to-day life. This book makes me think a lot about the social norms that we see are actually very inconvenient for overweight people. They're struggling from trying to fit in the seat of a flight to finding the right clothes that they also liked. Oftentimes, people assume that people from all sizes all have the same needs, so when they design products, they don't put in consideration of oversized people's needs. This largely applies to a lot of other aspects of people's life. For example, when COVID first hit, we discovered that the protective suits that doctors and nurses are wearing are generally too large for women, and it is very inconvenient for women doctors and nurses to change their pads and tampons when they're on period. And the hats they're wearing cannot hold long hairs because it is just simply designed for men or designed by men. And back to this book, all I wanted to say is this book stunned me in so many ways and challenged my thoughts on social norms. And that's all the books that I recommended to my friends on the International Women's Day 2018. I hope you enjoyed this video, and remember not to just pay attention to women's rights on International Women's Day, but to every details in our lives too. So if you have any comments about the books that I mentioned, or if you have thoughts on the books that you want to recommend to me, please leave a comment down below. And thumbs up to this video. I'll see you in my next bookish video. Stay healthy, happy reading. Bye.